The diner was nearly empty the Tuesday afternoon when Sarah Martinez caught her reflection in the chrome napkin dispenser. She turned away quickly, pulling her hair forward to shield the left side of her face. 3 years had passed since the accident, but some mornings it still felt like yesterday, the screech of tires, the shattering glass, and then darkness. When she woke up in the hospital, the burns had already begun their cruel work, leaving her skin puckered and discolored from her cheekbone to her jaw. The doctors called her lucky. She was alive, after all. But Sarah knew the truth that lived in the stares of strangers, in the way conversations stopped when she approached, in the pity that clouded people's eyes before they looked away. She was 28 years old and felt invisible. More coffee? Sarah asked the only customer still lingering at table 7, keeping the scarred side of her face angled away as she'd learned to do. The man looked up from his laptop, and Sarah braced herself for the familiar flicker of shock, the awkward pause, the too bright smile that people used to mask their discomfort. But it never came. "Please," he said simply, meeting her eyes with a warmth that caught her off guard. "And maybe a piece of that apple pie. It smells incredible." His name was David Chen, she'd learn later. He was 35, an architect who'd recently moved to their small Pennsylvania town to escape the chaos of New York City. He came back the next day, and the day after that, always sitting at table 7, always ordering the same thing, black coffee and whatever pie was fresh. He'd work on his designs, occasionally glancing up to watch the sunlight stream through the diner's windows, and he always left a generous tip with a sincere thank you. What he didn't do was stare. He didn't avert his eyes or stumble over his words. He treated Sarah like she was simply Sarah, not a tragedy to be pitied or a shock to be absorbed. "You're here again," she said on his 5th visit, allowing herself a small smile as she refilled his mug. "Best coffee in town," David replied. "Plus, the company's not bad." Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks, both of them. She wasn't used to compliments, wasn't used to someone looking at her like she was worth seeing. Most days she felt like a ghost haunting her own life, going through the motions while the world moved on without her. "I used to want to be a chef," she found herself saying, surprising herself with the confession. Before, I had plans to go to culinary school, open my own restaurant someday." "What's stopping you?" David asked, and the question was so straightforward, so absent of judgment, that Sarah felt something crack open inside her chest. "Look at me," she whispered, finally saying aloud what had haunted her for 3 years. "Who wants to eat food prepared by someone who looks like this?" David set down his coffee cup and leaned back, studying her with an intensity that would have made her uncomfortable if it hadn't been so devoid of pity. "You know what I see when I look at you," he said quietly. "I see someone who survived something terrible and still shows up every day with kindness in her eyes. I see someone who notices when I've had a rough day and brings an extra slice of pie without being asked. I see someone who makes everyone in this diner feel welcome, even when she doesn't feel welcome in her own skin." Sarah's eyes burned with tears. She'd taught herself not to cry in public. "You don't understand." "Maybe not entirely," David admitted. "But I know something about hiding." He paused, seeming to wrestle with whether to continue. "My sister was born with a facial difference, a cleft lip and palate. Growing up, I watched the world treat her like she was less than, like her appearance defined her worth. She's a pediatric surgeon now, saving children's lives. But it took years for her to believe she was beautiful, that she deserved to be seen." He pulled out his phone and showed Sarah a photo. A woman with a brilliant smile and a faint scar above her lip stood in surgical scrubs, surrounded by a grateful family. "That's Drive. Lisa Chen," he said with obvious pride. "My big sister, my hero. She taught me that beauty isn't about perfection. It's about light, the light that comes from inside and touches everyone around you." The diner suddenly felt too small, too full of the emotions Sarah had kept locked away for so long. She mumbled something about checking on the kitchen and fled, her vision blurred with tears. That night, lying in her small apartment, Sarah thought about David's words. She thought about the dreams she'd buried, the life she'd stopped living because she was too afraid to be seen. She thought about Dr. Lisa Chen and the children she saved, about all the people who would have missed out on her gifts if she'd let the world's cruelty make her small. David kept coming back. They began to talk, really talk, about architecture and cooking, about dreams deferred and second chances. He showed her his building designs, explaining how he tried to create spaces where people felt safe and seen. She shared her old recipes, the ones she'd created in those hopeful days before the accident, when the future had seemed limitless. "Would you let me take you somewhere?" David asked one Friday evening as the diner was closing. "There's something I want to show you." Sarah's instinct was to refuse, to retreat into the safety of her routine. But something in David's eyes, that same unwavering acceptance, made her nod. They drove to a community center on the edge of town. Inside, a cooking class was in full swing, but these weren't typical students. Sarah saw people with visible differences, burn survivors, people with limb differences, individuals with various conditions that made them stand out in a world obsessed with conventional beauty. "This is cooking without boundaries," David explained. Lisa helped establish it in cities across the country. "It's a place where people learn culinary skills and, more importantly, learn to reclaim their confidence." Sarah watched as the participants chopped vegetables, laughed over spilled flour, and celebrated each other's successes. The instructor, a man with severe burn scars on both arms, moved through the kitchen with the grace of someone who'd made peace with his story. "They're looking for a new instructor for the Tuesday and Thursday sessions," David said carefully. "I may have mentioned that I know someone extraordinary who has a gift for cooking and an even bigger gift for making people feel welcomed." "David, I can't." "You can," he interrupted gently. "You've been hiding your light because you think the world can't handle it. But Sarah, some of us are desperate for exactly the kind of light you have to offer." 3 months later, Sarah stood in front of her first class at Cooking Without Boundaries. Her hands shook as she introduced herself, as she shared her story, not just the accident, but the dreams that survived it. She looked at the faces before her, each carrying their own stories of survival, of days when getting out of bed felt like an act of defiance. "We're going to learn to make coq au vin tonight," she said, her voice growing stronger. "But more than that, we're going to remember that we're still here. We're still creating. We're still beautiful." David sat in the back, sketching something in his notebook. Later, he'd show her his design for an accessible teaching kitchen specifically for the program, his gift to a community that had given his sister so much. As Sarah demonstrated proper knife technique, she felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years. Not invisible anymore. Not hidden. Not less than. She felt like herself. That evening, as students laughed over their culinary triumphs and exchanged phone numbers to practice together, Sarah caught David's eye. He smiled, that same warm smile that had seen past her scars to the person she'd been afraid she'd lost forever. "Thank you," she mouthed. He shook his head and mouthed back, "You did this." But Sarah knew the truth. Sometimes all it takes is one person who refuses to look away, who sees beyond the surface to the light within. David hadn't made her beautiful, she'd always been beautiful. He'd simply helped her remember that her worth was never defined by her appearance, but by the immeasurable size of her heart and the dreams she refused to let die. In a world that too often judges by appearances, it was kindness that healed, compassion that transformed, and the courage to see and be seen that changed everything.